In the late afternoon of February 21st, 1978, 21-year-old Carol Hurst, who at the time was 7 months pregnant, had just been leaving Pantry Pride grocery store in Leesburg, Florida, when Freddie Lee Hall and Maxie Ruffin Jr. aggressively approached Miss Hurst, forcing her into her car. Hall and Ruffin had planned to use Hurst's car in an alleged robbery. Hurst was driven to a heavily wooded area where she had been brutally attacked, raped, and shot. After their evil deed, the two accomplices dragged Hurst's body deeper into the woods to cover up their cruel action. On the evening of that day, Hall and Ruffin traveled 56 miles to a convenience store in Hernando, Florida. The conduct of the pair aroused the suspicion of the store clerk, who called the sheriff of the substation located across the street from the convenience store. Deputy Lonnie Coburn responded to the call, arrived at the scene, confronting Hall and Ruffin in the store's parking lot. In the aggressive encounter, Hall and Ruffin managed to disarm and kill Coburn with his own gun, then fleeing the scene after the brutal incident. The death penalty has been a major controversy throughout history, both sides of the issue arguing against or in favor of capital punishment. In the Supreme Court case of Hall versus the state of Florida, Florida argued in favor of issuing the death penalty. But in this case, it required an expectation of the criminal that the court had deemed the convicted as mentally ill. In light of this, Florida had a long history with the death penalty. It had become infamous for sentencing criminals to death. Florida regained the title as the fourth highest state to execute 96 criminals since 1976, out of all the states where capital punishment is legalized. The state of Florida had criminals take an IQ test, where they determined the sanity of the convicted. If the result of the individual scored higher than the 70, the court reserved the right to sentence the person to death. The state argued its case before the Supreme Court, defending its decision by providing evidence worthy of his guilt in the crime, and how Hall had been determined fit for capital punishment. There are many arguments for capital punishment. Some include that it provides closure for families of victims. There are many victims of a single murder. The criminal gets caught, tried, and convicted, and it is understood that the punishment will be severe. But the person he has killed no longer has a part to play in this. Unfortunately, the murderer has deprived his family and friends of a loved one. Their grief begins with the murderer. It may not end with the murderer's execution, but the execution does engender a feeling of relief at no longer having to think about the ordeal, a feeling which often fails to arise while the murderer still lives on. A system in place for the purpose of granting justice cannot do so for the surviving victims. Unless the murderer himself is put to death, others can include the death penalty, how it deters crime, how it can be less expensive than life imprisonment, it can be less cruel than life imprisonment. In light of the brutality of some countries' prison systems, the death penalty satisfies the desire for vengeance, giving prosecutors extra leverage and gaining cooperation from reluctant defendants and co-conspirators. The Supreme Court of Florida should not give Freddie Lee Hall the death sentence because of his intellectual disabilities. After the Supreme Court case of Atkins versus Virginia, it had already been established that defendants who were intellectually disabled were ineligible for the death penalty because of their low intellectual functions and their lack of fundamental social and practical skills. Freddie Lee Hall had met all three factors. He had struggled to keep up with his siblings since he was a child, as well as suffered child abuse from his family. Therefore, he is not eligible for the death penalty. Although he scored a 71 in the IQ test, which is 1 point higher than the mandatory cutoff for the death penalty in the Supreme Court of Florida at the IQ of 70, it is infallible to detect a defendant's intellectual disability by just using an IQ test. Therefore, Hall should not be given the death penalty.
I think the guy should spend his life in prison because he committed a very bad, serious crime, but he's mentally ill, so he should not be executed.
Penalty is wrong for anyone because I truly don't think that we have the capability to take away someone's life. And when you add into the mixture that someone is mentally ill, they are clearly not in the right mindset to make their own choices and decisions. So the fact that you're telling you that you're going to kill them, even though they clearly can't even do simple things for themselves, I think that's just simply incorrect and wrong.
I believe mentally ill people should not be punished or what's it called, killed, because I'm Catholic and I believe every human has the right to life and that we should help them. Okay.
The court held that the 8th and 14th Amendments forbid the execution of persons with intellectual disability, in the case of Atkins versus Virginia. Therefore, Hall asked the Florida State Court to vacate his sentence, presenting evidence that included an IQ test score of 71. The court denied his motion, determining that the Florida statute mandated that he showed an IQ score of 70 or below before being permitted to present any additional evidence. The state Supreme Court rejected Hall's appeal, finding the state's 70-point threshold constitutional. This case eventually came to the Supreme Court, where a decision was made in 2014.